going to discuss is the kidnapping of baby Lindbergh. It's hard for people today to understand the level of fame Charles Lindbergh had achieved. In a time before television, he was the biggest celebrity, not just in America, but in the world, due to his aviation achievements. The son of a U.S. congressman, Lindbergh was an airmail pilot in 1926, flying from St. Louis to Chicago. During that period, he obtained financial backing from a group of St. Louis businessmen for an attempt to win the Orteig Prize of $25,000. This prize had been offered to whomever could make the first nonstop transatlantic flight between New York and Paris. He had a plane built to his specifications, which became the Spirit of St. Louis. On the morning of May 20th, 1927, he took off from Long Island. He was 25 years old. After flying some 3,600 miles in 33 and a half hours, he landed in Paris on the night of May 21st. To his surprise, he was greeted by a large crowd. Overnight, he had become a folk hero and one of the most well-known figures, not just in America, but in the world. On a trip to Mexico, he met Anne Morrow, the daughter of the U.S. ambassador to Mexico. They married in May 1929. Anne would serve as co-pilot and navigator on many of the flights they took around the world. Charles Lindbergh Jr. was born on June 22nd, 1930, which was also his mother's 24th birthday. The baby was called the Eaglet in the press. When the baby was only 20 months old, he was kidnapped from his bedroom at about 9 p.m. March 1st, 1932. At some point after his mother had put him to bed, a kidnapper climbed a ladder to the second-story nursery of their house in Hopewell, New Jersey. A ransom note demanded $50,000. The crime was discovered when Betty Gow, the nanny, went to check on her young charge 1 hour later. Local authorities turned over control of the investigation to the New Jersey State Police. Cursory investigation uncovered the ransom note, muddy but indistinct footprints in the nursery, a broken ladder discovered near the house, and footprints leading into the woods at the edge of the property. To put the crime into context, kidnappings were not unusual during the Great Depression. People who were desperate with no other means to make money would snatch a child or even an adult from a family with means as a way to make a quick buck. This case became a sensation because of Lindbergh's fame. H. Norman Schwarzkopf, who, yes, is the father of Stormy Norman from the Gulf War, he was the lead investigator, but Lindbergh was given a lot of control in deciding how the investigation was going to be conducted. 2 more ransom notes were received in quick succession, one upping the ransom demand to $70,000. This case had a lot of strange things happening. After attempts to contact the kidnappers failed to move the case forward, John Condon, who was a retired New York school teacher, placed an advertisement in a Bronx newspaper on March 8th, offering to serve as a go-between for the kidnappers and the Lindbergh family. The next day, Condon received a response from the kidnappers, accepting him as the intermediary. The next few weeks involved Condon placing newspaper ads with the kidnappers leaving messages across the city. On March 16th, the kidnappers gave Condon the baby's pajamas, which was supposed to be proof of life. On the night of April 2nd, Lindbergh waited in a car nearby while Condon met with a man known as John at St. Raymond Cemetery in the Bronx. Condon got John to agree to the original ransom of $50,000 in exchange for the child. The Treasury Department had recorded the serial numbers, and John took the money, which was primarily gold certificates, and delivered a note that gave the child's location as a boat near Martha's Vineyard. Lindbergh personally led the search of the boat, but the child was not found. On May 12, 1932, a horrific discovery was made when Charles Jr.'s body was found less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh's house. The decomposition of his body led investigators to believe that he had died the night of the abduction. The strongest theory is that the child accidentally was dropped as the kidnapper climbed down the ladder. He hit his head and died of blunt force trauma. The body was not found right away because searchers were mostly focusing on the roads and neighboring houses rather than the woods. The search, which involved law enforcement and volunteers, was chaotic and uncoordinated, leading to some areas being searched more than once while others were missed. This was another aspect of the investigation where Lindbergh had The U.S. Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, had been serving in an advisory capacity until the discovery of the body. The day after, President Herbert Hoover authorized the Bureau to serve as the primary agency and offered the full resources of the Department of Justice. Public outrage led Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, known as the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping across state lines a federal crime punishable by death. The law was passed on June 22nd, 1932, which would have been Charles' second birthday. So they passed that law in 4 months. Can you imagine anything like that happening today? The world would have to wait over a year before the next major break in the case. A service station attendant in New York recorded the license plate number of a man who had paid with a $10 gold certificate. Authorities traced the plate back to Bruno Hauptmann, a German carpenter living in the Bronx. Hauptmann was indicted on October 8, 1934, for the murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. The trial began January 3, 1935. After more than 5 weeks of testimony, which included Lindbergh taking the stand, and 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on February 13th. Hauptmann was sentenced to death. A series of appeals went all the way to the Supreme Court in December of 1935. But all were denied. Hauptmann was executed by the electric chair on April 3rd, 1936. So that all took place in just a little over a year. All the appeals and everything. Was it really Hauptmann? Some say no. Hauptmann maintained his innocence even at the hour of his execution. He was offered clemency, but he denied any deal that would require his admission of guilt. His wife continued for decades to try to clear his name. The evidence in the case was circumstantial. No one saw Hauptmann near the Lindberghs' home, and no physical evidence placed him at the scene. Modern legal analysts believe the prosecution relied heavily on interpretation by expert testimony rather than direct proof. It is believed some evidence was misinterpreted or could have had another explanation. For example, the ladder was determined to be Hauptmann's because the prosecution said they matched the wood in the ladder to a board in Hauptmann's attic. But the match was not considered to be scientifically rigorous by today's standards. While Hauptmann had spent some of the ransom money, he claimed the $13,000 that was found in his garage was in a box that belonged to Isidore Fish, a friend who had departed for Germany, and he died while he was abroad. Fish was known as a con artist, and he had left the country rather suddenly. Hauptmann only opened the box and spent any of the money after Fish died. Mr. Condon's identification was weak. The meeting took place in the dark, and his story changed over time. Condon had previously described a man who differed from Hauptmann. So I think that was this one. So you can see the drawing kind of, they got the nose and the eyes all wrong, so. Could Condon have misidentified the suspect, or was he being pressured by investigators? Some theories suggest the kidnapping had to have been carried out by multiple suspects because the ransom negotiations were too complex and involved different skill sets. Authorities were under incredible pressure to solve the crime quickly. The case was called the trial of the century. That was the first one, before OJ and all that other trials of the century. The public was heavily invested and demanded justice for baby Lindbergh. The stage was set for television, and Hauptmann made an obvious suspect. In addition to Lindbergh, a grieving father, interjecting himself into the investigation, Hauptmann accused police of violent coercion. Many legal scholars today believe this would not have resulted in a conviction if tried under our modern standards. If not Hauptmann, then who? Fish makes a viable candidate, though evidence does strongly suggest more than one player was involved. Some believe the person or persons responsible had inside help from a household staff member or a construction worker who had been at the Lindbergh home, because the perp had knowledge of the layout of the house and the baby's routine. They knew which window belonged to the nursery and what time the child would be left alone in his bed. Yet Lindbergh himself was reluctant to investigate his staff too heavily. He did not believe they could have been involved. After the trial, the family moved to Europe in 1935 for a time to escape the intense media pressure and for the safety of their second son, John, who was born in 1932. The parents lived in constant fear for John's safety and had received numerous letters and phone calls threatening harm to John unless payments were made. After little Charles's death, the couple would wait 5 years after John's birth before having another child, but they would go on to have 4 more. Land was born in 1937, Anne in 40, Scott in 42, and Reeve in 45. So the next mystery we're going to talk about is the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Her life is the stuff of legends that everyone learned about in grade school. Charles Lindbergh's associate in aviation, Amelia Earhart, earned her fame in 1928 when she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air, just 1 year after Lindbergh. Her level of fame was on par with Lindbergh's. In 1937, she attempted to fly around the world. Earhart's goal was to become the first woman to circumnavigate the globe by air. She chose to take a grueling 29,000-mile equatorial route. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, vanished over the Pacific Ocean. The plane, an Electra 10E, and their bodies were never recovered. Over the years, there have been plenty of speculation, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories. When President Trump recently declassified over 4,600 pages of material relating to Earhart, no major discoveries were uncovered. Much of the released documents detail unsubstantiated claims, such as a claim from a U.S. Army sergeant who said he saw a grave on Saipan and was told it belonged to, as he said, white people who came from the sky. Other memos detailed the FBI and Navy's evaluation of the theory that Earhart was captured by Japanese forces, but there was no solid evidence to support these claims either. Historians still believe Earhart and Noonan simply ran out of fuel over the Pacific while trying to find the remote Howland Island. And this is where it gets tricky because I'm going to have to say some complicated words here. In 2020, things got interesting because it wasn't already interesting in 2020. While everyone got bored in isolation, researchers looking at satellite images identified a visual anomaly which has become known as Taraya, the Taraya object. The object is in a lagoon in Nikumaroro, a small island in Kiribati, which is located halfway between Australia and Hawaii. Nikumaroro is about 400 miles southeast of Howland Island. Although underwater, the object has been visible in photos dating back to 1938, which is the year after the disappearance. A team of researchers from Purdue University, the Purdue Research Foundation, and the Archaeological Legacy Institute had planned to travel to Nikumaroro to inspect the object in November of 2025. The plan was to take photos and videos, use sonar to scan the area, and then dredge and lift the object from the water so researchers can try to identify it. Unfortunately, just 2 weeks before their expedition, the team had to postpone their travel due to delays in obtaining permits from the government of Kiribati and the approaching South Pacific cyclone season. That trip is yet to happen. If the team successfully verifies that the object is Earhart's missing plane, Purdue and ALI plan to conduct a follow-up recovery operation. Purdue originally funded Earhart's plane, which was called a flying laboratory, in 1937. Earhart had intended to return the plane to Purdue after her journey. Therefore, the university hopes to eventually bring the wreckage of the plane back to its campus as it would have been if Earhart's mission had been a success. Then the world will finally have an answer to the fate of Amelia.
They developed all kinds of stuff, haven't they? Like shoes and this and that, different places.
Yeah.
And she did go to Purdue.
Yeah.
Tammy was always, well, you know.
And Gus Grissom.
Yeah.
The Black Dahlia is our next mystery. On January 15th, 1947, a young mother in Los Angeles was taking her children for a walk in an undeveloped neighborhood when she made a horrific discovery. At first, she thought she saw a mannequin lying on the ground because of the unnatural way the limbs were bent. When she took a closer look, she saw it was a naked young woman who had been surgically severed in half at the waist. However, she hadn't been murdered there, as her internal organs had been removed and not a drop of blood was left. Her face was bruised and cut with a slash running from each side of her mouth. The coroner would later rule that the cause of death was hemorrhaging from lacerations to her face and shock from repeated strikes to the head. News of this sordid scene spread quickly, and the media stormed the scene before law enforcement could contain the spectacle. Reporters, photographers, curious passersby, and even children trampled and contaminated the crime scene. Footprints, tire tracks, and potential evidence was destroyed. The body was moved before proper forensic protocols were followed. Police had a challenge in identifying the woman because the murder had been so grisly they couldn't release photos to the press. They took fingerprints immediately and sent them off to the FBI in Washington, D.C. by snail mail, but they knew it would be days before they heard anything. A newspaper staffer suggested the police use the paper's sound photo machine, which was an early version of a fax machine, to send the prints. Hours later, they had their ID. The FBI had fingerprints on file from when the victim had applied for a job at an Army base. She was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. The public's interest was immediate and intense. The day after her death, the Examiner sold the most copies it had since World War II ended. To feed the public's curiosity, tabloid journalism, full of rumors and inaccuracies, ruled the day. When one reporter learned that the victim had been nicknamed Black Dahlia, a combination of a 1946 movie called The Blue Dahlia and a reference to the black clothes that she favored, the name stuck. The media became an obstacle due to their sensationalized reporting. Meanwhile, the police investigation focused on Short's mysterious life and tried to answer questions about the men she knew and the life she led. Elizabeth had moved to LA reportedly to pursue an acting career, but she would be dead within 6 months. In those short 6 months, she had lived in multiple places and worked multiple jobs. She struggled financially, but always had money for necessities like rent. A former police officer, Vince Carter, said, her roommates, the bartenders, and the hotel clerks all came up with the same story. She was secretive, never one to confide. She never said what she was really doing, or who she was really going out with, or where she was really going. In December 1946, Elizabeth left LA for San Diego. She told her friends she was scared, but she didn't elaborate. In San Diego, she met a young woman who invited her to stay with her family. Elizabeth admitted to this family that she was hiding from an ex-boyfriend. After a few weeks, 2 men and a woman came to the home looking for Short. When she heard about the visit, she became frightened and refused to see them. They eventually left, and Elizabeth decided it was time to relocate again. On January 8th, she got a ride back to LA with the traveling salesman she had dated. He dropped her off at a hotel where she said she was meeting her sister. Her sister later said this was not true. Hotel staff noticed her making several phone calls in the lobby and becoming increasingly distressed. She left the hotel at 10 p.m., which was the last confirmed time she was seen alive. Officer Merrill McBride believes she saw Short just hours before her death on January 14th, but the woman in question did not identify herself as Elizabeth. McBride said the young woman approached her and she said she was, quote, sobbing in terror, claiming someone threatened to kill her and saying she was too shaken up to return to the bar to get her purse. The officer went with her, but the man was gone. Later, McBride saw the same woman exiting the bar with 2 men and a woman. So she checked on her. The woman appeared fine, but if this was indeed Elizabeth, she was only hours from her death. Although police had clues like handwritten notes from the murderer, no one was ever charged. In the 3 years after the murder, LAPD received several leads and false confessions, but none brought results. In 1949, a grand jury convened to discuss the inability of LAPD's homicide unit to close cases. In front of a grand jury, Detective Harry Hansen, who was the lead on the case, said he still believed the murderer was a medical man. Hansen searched for the killer for 23 years until his retirement. The police worked their way through a lengthy list of possible suspects, clearing many as they went. Some people, however, would remain suspects until their deaths. The sheer volume of potential suspects and false confessions overwhelmed investigators. High on the list of suspects is Dr. George Hodel, a gynecologist. It was rumored he had dated Short. He also threw parties for the Hollywood elite. He became a suspect in 1949 after being arrested for sexually assaulting his teenage daughter. Although he was acquitted of that crime, he was on the police's radar. They wiretapped his house and recorded some incriminating statements involving the death of his secretary, who had died of a drug overdose, and Short's murder. He made a comment along the lines of, they can't talk to her because she's dead, in reference to the secretary. He relocated to the Philippines for the next 40 years. Nothing says innocence like that. Most of the known information linking him to the murder came from his own son, Steve, a former LAPD detective and a private investigator.
I have read about that guy.
He looked into his father's possible involvement in 1999 after Hodl's death. Steve found a photo that appeared to be Short in his father's belongings. Steve devoted years of investigating and research to building a pretty solid case. An LA deputy district attorney told Steve he would have filed murder charges if Hodl was alive. Steve believes his father was friendly with officers who protected him. In the 1940s, the LAPD did have a notorious reputation for accepting bribes and protecting wealthy and connected. Modern researchers believe some suspects may have been shielded by the police. Another theory names Marvin Margulis as the killer. Margulis was a pre-med student who lived with Short for 12 days and was questioned by police. His name also came up in the Zodiac killer investigation. He died in 1993, but two veteran LAPD detectives reported that several clues pointed to Margulis being responsible for both Short and the Zodiac killings. Leslie Dillon was a bellhop and aspiring writer who had detailed knowledge of the crime. When he wrote to police about the case, they were convinced he knew too much. His letters disturbed the police, but they could not connect him to the crime in any other ways. Some theorize the crime may have involved more than one person, and Dillon was part of that conspiracy, therefore gaining the knowledge he possessed. Dillon also had connections to Mark Hansen, another name still on the suspect list. Mark Hansen was a nightclub owner who was friendly with Elizabeth. She stayed at his house sometimes. Some of her belongings were in his possession after her death. Hansen had a reputation for being a volatile person. He did have the means and opportunity, but he had no medical training. Today, while on the list, he isn't viewed as the most likely candidate. Will the case ever be solved definitively? Probably not. Witnesses have died. Over the decades, key evidence has been lost or destroyed by floods, fires, and even routine purging. In 1947, police lacked tools like DNA testing, modern blood analysis, and behavioral profiling. Detective Hansen firmly believed she was killed by someone with a medical background, but hospitals refused to fully cooperate at the time. They didn't want the bad publicity. A lot of questions still remain in this case.
Is that a crime photo, a police photo over on the right?
Yes, she got arrested for drinking underage.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Then the Winchester Mystery House is going to be our next one.
It's a cool place.
If you're ever in San
Yeah,
Jose,
me too.
California, you may want to visit the Winchester Mystery House.
Where is it?
It's in San Jose, California.
Okay.
This historic landmark opened its doors for tours to the public in 1923, just 9 months after its owner and creator died. This was once the residence of Sarah Winchester, the widow of William Winchester and heiress to much of the Winchester repeating arms fortune. Sarah was born in 1839 in New Haven, Connecticut. She married her husband in 1862. Sarah had difficulty with pregnancy. In 1866, Sarah at last gave birth to a daughter, Annie. Tragically, Annie was diagnosed with a rare metabolic disorder and died just 6 weeks later. She never had another child. Her husband, suffering from tuberculosis, followed Annie in death in 1881. These losses deeply affected Sarah. In 1885, Sarah had been developing rheumatoid arthritis. Her doctor recommended a warmer climate, so at the age of 46, Sarah moved to California and purchased an 8-room farmhouse. She began expanding it. Over the next 38 years, the home grew into a sprawling labyrinth of stairways that led nowhere, doors opening into walls, and windows overlooking other rooms. Legend claims she was guided by spirits, perhaps those killed by Winchester rifles, and that she built continuously to appease them. At its largest, the house had about 500 rooms.
Okay.
When the 1906 earthquake hit, the house suffered serious damage. A 7-story tower and most of the chimneys collapsed. One entire wing was destroyed, along with the 3rd and 4th story additions. Sarah had the rubble cleaned up, but she didn't try to rebuild everything after the earthquake. This left doors that opened to nothing where balconies had once been, pipes that were protruding from where once window boxes were, and staircases that once led to upper floors suddenly ending. So you can see they put a sign there that says door to nowhere, which is what we used to call the door on my 2nd floor until Chris finally built the balcony. It was years. But why would she build such a curious monstrosity of a house if she wasn't mad? According to Bruce Spoon, who wrote a master thesis about Winchester in 1951, Sarah was a woman of means and creativity. She had a lot of money and no child to inherit it. So she built onto her home to keep workers employed and to express her unique artistic vision. He came to this conclusion after interviewing people who knew Sarah, as well as reviewing media coverage. Some legends would have you believe that Sarah was a mysterious old crank, driven crazy by spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, who rarely left the house and built continuously for 38 years. In fact, Sarah owned other homes and did not even live in this house all the time. Yes, those who personally knew Sarah and the staff that spent every day with her said she was of sound mind, had no interest in seances, and experienced no hauntings. Sarah's neighbors and friends, and those who worked for her, were upset to read about superstitious and supernatural claims being made after Sarah's passing. Many of them said Sarah was clear-headed and savvier with her finances than most men. So how did the Winchester house and Sarah herself become the stuff of legends and lore? Easy, marketing. When Sarah died, the house was in disrepair and was considered to have no monetary value. But John and Mamie Brown saw an opportunity. They turned the house into a tourist attraction. Mamie Brown was the house's first tour guide, and she told many stories about the seances Sarah held trying to contact her husband. She said Sarah kept building because spirits told her she was never allowed to finish the house or she would die. Although there were simple explanations for many things, it made a better story and drew more visitors and curiosity to twist them and imply something otherworldly. While the destruction caused by the earthquake resulted in doors to nowhere and staircases that just ended, other parts of the house had windows and walls that overlooked other rooms because those were once exterior walls until the expansion. It had nothing to do with Sarah's poor state of mind or spirituality. A bell tower that was used to call construction workers and also served as a fire alarm was said to be summoning spirits. Ghostly music that came from the house in the middle of the night was actually a result of Sarah playing an organ when she just couldn't sleep. Some mysteries were added to the house after Sarah's death. For example, it was claimed that Sarah had a fascination with the number 13, which resulted in 13 windows in certain rooms and the like. But these, along with other irregular features, were actually added after Sarah's death. Yet the power of suggestion is strong, and visitors to the house report cold spots in empty rooms, footsteps in the hallways where no one is there, and doorknobs turning. Tour guides have claimed to see a shadowy figure in black, believed to be Mrs. Winchester, roaming the halls. The bell tower allegedly rings on its own at midnight. While these stories may be fiction, the house itself inspired 2 other pieces of creativity. The first, Stephen King for Rose Red, and the other is Walt Disney for Disneyland's The Haunted Mansion. So the one in Disneyland is modeled after the Winchester house. And our next case is the disappearance of Walter Collins. How many of you know about this one?
I've never heard of one.
Okay, good, I like this one. Losing a child and not knowing his fate would be a nightmare for any parent. For Christine Collins, the nightmare was even greater. On Saturday, March 10th, 1928, Christine gave her 9-year-old son, Walter, a dime to see a movie. They lived a quiet life together in a Los Angeles neighborhood. Christine's ex-husband was in jail, and Christine worked for the telephone company to support them. It would have been just an ordinary weekend, except Walter never came home. For the next 5 months, Christine anxiously awaited word from the police about Walter. Finally, in August, police told Christine they had at last found Walter, alive and well, and in Illinois of all places. Christine gladly paid the $70 in travel fees for her boy to come home, but when the boy arrived, Christine knew something was wrong. "I do not think that is my son," Christine told the police. The police were under a lot of pressure to close the case, so they told her to try the boy out. Despite her hesitation, Christine agreed. And this is a picture that she had taken with him. I think that was actually by the press, but days passed and Christine became more and more convinced that the boy living in her house was not her son. After 3 weeks, she returned to the police and told them so. Armed with Walter's dental records and statements from her friends, Christine insisted the police listen to her. The boy they had sent home with her was most definitely not Walter. This greatly displeased Captain J.J. Jones. He simply refused to hear her. He accused Christine of either trying to make fools out of the police department or looking to shirk her parental responsibility and have the state support her son instead. When Christine refused to back down, Jones told her, "You're insane and ought to be in a madhouse. You're under arrest and I'm going to send you to the psychopathic ward." That's exactly what he did. He had Christine forcibly committed to the Los Angeles County General Hospital psychiatric ward under Code 12 internment, which meant for someone who was deemed difficult or an inconvenience. During the 5 days that Christine was in the psych ward, the boy who claimed to be Walter admitted that he was an imposter. His real name was Arthur Hutchins. He was a 12-year-old from Iowa. Arthur's mother had died, and he had run away from home to escape his father and stepmother. While hitchhiking and doing odd jobs to survive, he was at a cafe in Illinois when a fellow diner remarked how much he looked like Walter Collins, the boy whose image had been printed in newspapers across America. That's when Arthur got an idea. He wanted to move to Hollywood to meet his favorite actor, Tom Mix, and he thought impersonating Walter would get him to sunny California, which it did. The LAPD was only too happy to help him in facilitating the ruse. So this is a picture of Walter, and that's Arthur.
Wow.
So you can see how similar they looked, but not exactly. Christine was released from the hospital and sued the city and the LAPD for false imprisonment. Christine's ordeal was far from over. It took her 2 years and 2 trials before a judge ordered that Captain Jones pay Christine $10,800. Jones cried poor and never paid her. As for young Arthur, he was not charged with a crime. The authorities treated him as a misguided runaway and returned him to his family in Iowa, where he led a pretty ordinary life. Arthur would speak out about the incident years later and express remorse for causing Christine pain. Meanwhile, Walter was still missing. The police learned a serial killer, Gordon Stewart Northcott, had been murdering young boys in the area. They suggested he had likely killed Walter, but at that point, Christine obviously had no faith in the police department, so she didn't just take them at their word. In September of that year, Northcott was arrested while attempting to flee to Canada. He would be found guilty of kidnapping, sexually assaulting, and murdering 3 boys. However, it was believed he could have had as many as 20 victims. Yet neither Walter's body nor any of his clothing or belongings were found at Northcott's ranch. Christine never gave up hope that Walter was alive and would someday reappear. When she died in 1964, Walter Collins was still missing. The next one is D.B. Cooper. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a man going by the name of Dan Cooper used cash at the counter of Northwest Orient Airlines in Portland, Oregon to purchase a one-way ticket to Seattle. This rather mundane event launched one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in FBI history. Cooper was quiet and unassuming. He appeared to be middle-aged and wore a business suit. While waiting for takeoff, he ordered a drink. Then, just after 3 p.m., he handed a stewardess a note that said he had a bomb in his briefcase and he wanted her to sit down with him. In shock, the stewardess did as she was instructed. Cooper opened his briefcase to reveal to her a mass of wires and red-colored sticks. He told her to write down what he said. Then he told the stewardess to take this new note to the plane's captain. The note demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. When the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the flight's other 36 passengers for the money and parachutes. He kept several crew members and the plane took off again, this time bound for Mexico City. A little after 8 p.m., when the plane hovered somewhere between Seattle and Reno, Cooper stunned those on board when he jumped out of the back of the plane with a parachute and the ransom money. Cooper disappeared into the night, and his fate, as well as his true identity, remains a mystery still. The FBI learned of the hijacking while the plane was still in flight and immediately launched an investigation that lasted for years. They interviewed hundreds of people and tracked leads across the country. By the 5-year anniversary, the agency had investigated more than 800 suspects, eliminating all but 2 dozen. Did Cooper even survive his daring jump? The parachute he used could not be steered. His clothes and shoes were not suitable for a rough landing in a wooded area. He jumped into the woods at night, which would be dangerous for an experienced skydiver, but Cooper did not appear to be experienced. The theory the hijacker died was given more credence in 1980 when a boy found a rotting package of 20s, $5,800 in all. The serial numbers matched those on the ransom money, yet they found no body. Fun fact, the name D.B. Cooper was created by the media. While the hijacker used the name Dan Cooper, no one ever said anything about a middle name that started with a B. In 2025 and 2026, the FBI quietly declassified files of NORJAC, which stood for Northwest Hijacking Investigation. The files included interview summaries, suspect profiles, and notes from early 1970s field agents. These files revealed that Cooper had extensive knowledge of the Boeing 727's layout. He appeared methodical and calm. He took apart one parachute, perhaps to inspect or modify it. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., who was initially a strong suspect, was ruled out by the FBI. But new documents show investigators continued to revisit him now. McCoy was a Vietnam veteran who committed a similar hijacking months later. They have his tie. Cooper took the tie off before he jumped out of the plane. Unfortunately, DNA evidence has remained inconclusive. The active investigation was closed in 2026. Even after all this time, no trace of D.B. Cooper has ever been found. Bigfoot is our next one. A cryptid is an animal whose existence is disputed or unsubstantiated, like the Yeti or the Chupacabra. But Bigfoot remains one of the most actively reported cryptids in North America and an enduring American mystery. Dozens of new sightings are logged every year. Most sightings occur in heavily forested areas of the U.S. and Canada, especially in the Pacific Northwest, Appalachia, and the Mountain West and parts of the South. A cryptid tracking database lists 90 documented sightings, mostly in remote forests and river corridors. Bigfoot has a lot of fans, as evidenced by the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, which logs new reports including what they call Class A sightings, which are clear visual encounters. Class B sightings are when you just hear something but you don't see anything. Reports typically include details of the creature's appearance. All similarly report great height of between 6 and 8 feet, long arms, bulky torsos, unusual gait, and deep vocalizations. Perhaps adding credence to Bigfoot's existence is that variations of stories involving these creatures date back centuries, well before social media and AI videos. Bigfoot stories date back to indigenous tribes. In 1811, a footprint was discovered and documented by an explorer. In 1924, prospectors said they had violent encounters with gorilla men. 1967 brought the most famous footage, known as the Patterson-Gimlin film, which has been called the film that defined Bigfoot. Filmed on October 20th, 1967 in Bluff Creek near Orleans, California, in Six Rivers National Forest, amateur Bigfoot researchers Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were hoping to encounter the creature. Patterson had a 16mm camera with him when they spotted the creature walking by a creek bed. He filmed the creature for about 1 minute before it disappeared among the trees. The creature was believed to be female because of the appearance of breasts and was nicknamed Patty. So I'm gonna play the movie for you.
Good.
It gets better. It's really shaky in the beginning. I don't know if you panicked or what.
Probably. I'm having trouble here. Oh, he's walking toward it, I guess, that's why. fake. I mean, I think that's a person.
Okay, so that's the movie. Since the film was first made public, it has been heavily debated whether the film captured a real creature or just a person in a suit. Supporters cite anatomical realism, natural gait, and muscle movement. Skeptics say it's nothing more than a hoax. Decades later, a man named Bob Hieronymus claimed that he wore a costume at Patterson's behest for the filming. Hollywood costume designers and scientists have analyzed the footage, but no consensus has ever been met. Even after all this time, the film is still labeled as unverified, meaning it has neither been proven nor debunked. The FBI has investigated alleged hair samples discovered supposedly from Bigfoot, but the hair turned out to be a common deer. Yet Bigfoot remains one of the most persistent mysteries. Is Sasquatch an entire species of mammal that has been largely able to live in secrecy in the shadows of forest trees, or is this just too far-fetched to be believed? Witnesses who have spotted Bigfoot seem to believe it is possible after seeing for themselves. This is a report of a Class A sighting in Texas, seen by 3 people. We wouldn't have noticed if it hadn't been for the dogs that went out barking and running at it. Once they saw what it was, when it stepped through the tree line, they stopped barking and ran back to the house. So then we tried to video it and take pictures, but it's so far away that when we blow them up to try to see what it is hard to tell. We called the owner of the land because I lease out there and was telling him that there's something cutting across his pasture and going down towards a pond. It was standing up walking, and then as it got closer to the pond, it just went down on all fours. It was spotted coming through the tree area and was not running, but making it quickly across the pasture. I have never heard of any incidents around here. It was 7:09 p.m., 90 degrees outside, clear weather beginning to get dark. It is part of the 7-acre pasture. Whatever it was went toward the pond at the back of the property. It came from a tree area. But if you don't want to travel out of state to have a chance at spotting the elusive creature, in Illinois, the most active region for decades has been the Shawnee National Forest, near the Garden of Gods area. Of course, there is a Bigfoot statue in the Garden of Gods, so maybe it's just, again, the power of suggestion. There also have been reports near Bloomington and Peoria that describe a creature crossing rural roads at night. Bigfoot enthusiasts believe Illinois is a hotspot because its dense forests, river valleys, and farmland provide ideal cover. And our last one tonight will be the Tylenol murders. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman stayed home from school with a sore throat and a cold on Wednesday, September 29, 1982. Her father, Dennis, gave her 1 capsule of extra-strength Tylenol that his wife had purchased just the night before at a Jewel Osco store in Elk Grove Village. Mary took the medicine. Minutes later, he heard Mary go into the bathroom, shut the door, and then he heard an alarming thud. Dennis went to the door, but Mary was not responding. When he opened the door, he saw her lying on the floor. By the time help arrived, Mary was in full cardiac arrest. Efforts to revive her on the scene and at the hospital failed. She was pronounced dead at 10 a.m. Doctors and her parents assumed her death was caused by an undiagnosed heart condition or an aneurysm. 27-year-old Adam Janis made a stop at a Jewel Osco in Arlington Heights. He had taken the day off from his job at the post office. He enjoyed lunch with his wife, took a couple of extra-strength Tylenol, and soon told his wife he wasn't feeling well. He went to his bedroom, and a few minutes later, his wife found him unconscious and convulsing. He was pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. Lynn Reiner, who's right there, had given birth to her 4th child just 5 days before. She bought a bottle of regular strength Tylenol and returned home around 3:30 p.m. Her mother-in-law had been babysitting, and Lynn told her she was feeling nauseous. Just as her husband arrived home with her daughter, Lynn fell to the floor in convulsions. She returned to the hospital where she had given birth a week earlier and died there. That same afternoon in Lombard, Mary McFarland, age 31, was fighting a headache at work. She popped 2 extra-strength Tylenol capsules, which she had bought the evening before. She had put about a third of the capsule she had purchased into a small Dristan bottle she kept in her purse. Then she walked to the break room table and told her co-workers that she didn't feel well right before she collapsed on the table. She too died at the hospital, which was just 10 minutes away. Because she had her medicine in the Dristan bottle, it took them a little longer to connect that. 4 mysterious deaths in 4 different Chicagoland hospitals. These deaths may have remained unconnected were it not for Adam Janis's younger brother and his brother's wife. After Adam died, his brother Stanley, age 24, and Stanley's wife Teresa, age 19, returned to the house with splitting headaches brought on by the shocking ordeal. Stanley took the same bottle of Tylenol and took 2 of the capsules, while Teresa called her parents to inform them of Adam's death. After she ended the call, Teresa also took 2 of the capsules. When Stanley collapsed, Teresa called 911. The same paramedics tried to revive Stanley, while Teresa called her parents again. Then Teresa collapsed as well. By the time the couple arrived at the hospital, both were in full cardiac arrest. Dr. Thomas Kim, the medical director at Northwest Community Hospital's ICU, had been about ready to leave for the day. As soon as he heard about the arrival of Adam's brother and sister-in-law, he got ready to work. The ER had revived Teresa's heart, but she had no brain activity. Stanley had similar results. Dr. Kim had called poison control to see what could have caused the death of 3 healthy young adults in such quick succession. The possible answer was cyanide poisoning. Meanwhile, 2 firefighters who had been following that day's calls figured that Mary Kellerman's death bore a striking resemblance to that of Janis's, down to the use of Tylenol. Bottles were collected and blood samples were drawn from Stanley and Teresa. The next morning, the medical examiner opened the bottles to the smell of bitter almond, which is a sign of cyanide. A press conference was held, and Chicago police went through the streets with bullhorns, warning commuters and residents against taking Tylenol. It soon became one of the most covered news stories since the assassination of JFK 20 years earlier. All 3 national networks covered it for weeks, and nearly every newspaper covered it through the fall, with over 100,000 individual stories written. The FDA sent field personnel to the Johnson & Johnson facilities where the contaminated pills had been produced. They arrived at the Pennsylvania plant on Thursday afternoon and at a Texas plant on Friday morning. Although such inspections typically take days or even weeks, officials decided within hours that neither plant was responsible for the poisonings. On Friday evening, Chicago police were called to the apartment of Paula Prince, and she's pictured right there. She had died Wednesday evening, but since she had not been scheduled to work on Thursday, nobody knew anything was amiss until Friday. She was found lying on the floor near a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Hours later, Chicago Mayor Jane Byrne instructed all city residents to hand over all bottles of Tylenol to local police stations with a note describing where and when it was bought. Don't take Tylenol in any form was her decree. At the time, Tylenol was the most important product in Johnson & Johnson's arsenal. Sales in 1982 had been expected to approach $500 million and was 20% of the company's profits. Tylenol was America's most popular medicine, and at the time, generic options were not available. Johnson & Johnson's approach has been viewed as the most ethical and effective crisis management approach in American corporate history. In fact, it was thought to be so well done that the example is taught in Harvard business classes. Johnson & Johnson executives withdrew every Tylenol bottle on every store shelf, about 31 million of them. This was the largest drug recall in history and cost the company $100 million. The company made haste to add protective packaging seals. Glue was added to the flaps of the boxes of pill bottles, and a plastic ring was added around the necks and foil over the bottle's mouth. Their leadership became industry standard and made mass poisonings far less likely. This gives the story a happy note. Our drugs were made safer by the company's swift response and focus on safety first. But did a killer have easy access to Johnson & Johnson's distribution system? Was their tamper-resistant packaging enacted so swiftly because Johnson & Johnson had already been considering it for multiple contamination reports within the previous 3 years? In reality, J&J executives only recalled limited lots associated with contamination, even when they were informed on Friday, October 1st, of a copycat poisoning in California. By Monday, October 4th, Johnson & Johnson determined those capsules contained strychnine. The company resisted a nationwide recall until news of the copycat poisonings became public and caused a wider panic. At this point, execs realized a nationwide recall was the only way to prevent unending copycat issues. 29 hours before the first victim collapsed, 2 Kane County Sheriff's deputies pulled into a Howard Johnson's parking lot in Elgin. As they headed into the restaurant, the duo saw 2 large cardboard boxes in the parking lot with extra-strength Tylenol capsules printed on the outside. The boxes looked as if they had accidentally slipped from a truck. One of the boxes was open with at least 24 bottles inside. Hundreds of capsules were strewn on the ground. There also was a substantial amount of white powder. One of the deputies picked up the powder and rubbed it between his fingers. They said it looked like hundreds of capsules had been emptied out. They looked at them and found a couple capsules had been put back together. They thought drug dealers had planned to mix Tylenol with cocaine, but since Tylenol is not a controlled substance, they just blew it off. They drove off and left the boxes behind. Minutes later, one of the deputies pulled to the side of the road, suddenly and violently ill with vomiting, headache, and dizziness, symptoms of acute cyanide poisoning that can occur by inhalation or absorption through the skin. The other deputy had similar symptoms later. Neither linked their symptoms with the find in the parking lot until after the poisonings made headlines. Many investigators missed this vital clue and did not understand its significance. The superintendent of the Chicago PD admitted that he didn't know about the wholesale boxes until decades later, but he didn't think it was very relevant since anyone could have breached the distribution system. Perhaps the fact that the system could be breached by anyone was a big part of the problem. Police officials said boxes of Tylenol were shipped directly from J&J production to stores in boxes sealed in plastic wrap. They said the contamination could not have taken place inside the distribution system because stores would have noticed broken plastic, thereby absolving J&J of responsibility. However, most stores that stocked Tylenol in the 1980s only sold a few bottles a week, so it didn't make sense for them to accept large shrink-wrapped boxes. Instead, most of the product was shipped to third-party rack jobbers, contract warehousing, and stocking companies that rent shelf space in retail stores. The rack jobbers were not really mentioned in the original coverage because the investigators, FDA, and Johnson & Johnson didn't bring it up. When I was a kid and hearing this story, I was under the impression that there was a crazy person who was picking up bottles off the store shelf and filling them with poison. And this is what the public was led to believe. Yet, on September 30th, the FDA found a contaminated bottle of extra-strength Tylenol in the stock room of a drugstore in Schaumburg, where the public would not have had access. There were at least 4 other deaths in which victims took Tylenol and then collapsed. All were later found to have died of cyanide poisoning. The details of these cases were kept secret for months. There were other mysterious deaths as well in which bodies weren't tested for cyanide. They probably thought the same thing Mary Kellerman's parents thought, that it was aneurysm or sudden heart failure. The death toll is likely much higher than the 7 known victims. The biggest rack jobber in Chicagoland was Jewel in Melrose Park, which had stocked the shelves at many of the stores where the contaminated Tylenol was purchased. Roger Arnold was a 48-year-old rack jobber. Arnold is a self-described amateur chemist who admitted to purchasing cyanide in bulk 6 months before the murders, had bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, owned 5 illegal guns, and had an outstanding arrest warrant for aggravated assault, had been overheard on multiple occasions bragging that he had killed people using his Tylenol stash, had recently gotten divorced, and had told his supervisor at work that he was mad at people and wanted to throw acid at them or poison them. He was described by coworkers as a dangerous loner whom they suspected of the Tylenol killings as soon as the news broke. Arnold was confirmed as a prime suspect. He bragged about his work as an expert in military demolitions, which was a lie, and his fascination with chemistry. His rants turned even darker with his divorce in the summer of '82. His wife, leaving, had left him with no family. They had no children, he was an only child, and his parents were dead. A few weeks after the murders, a pub owner, Marty Sinclair, called police after overhearing a conversation involving Arnold and some regulars. Arnold said he had cyanide at home and anyone could use it to kill. Arnold claimed no one would ever know. He was arrested, released, and put under surveillance. When he was named by the press as a suspect, he grew enraged and he blamed Sinclair. On June 18, 1983, Arnold approached a man leaving the bar and shot him in the chest. The man died in seconds. It turned out the man was not Sinclair, but a 46-year-old father of 3, John Stanishaw, who just happened to bear a strong resemblance to Sinclair. Arnold was convicted of Stanishaw's murder and went to prison for 15 years. He spent his final years deeply depressed and died in 2008. Richard Bezchek was superintendent of the Chicago PD from January 11th, 1980 to April 29th, 1983. He was appointed by Mayor Byrne at the age of 37 and was the youngest in department history. He stepped down just hours before Harold Washington was sworn in as mayor. He has stated he believes the killings were a crime of passion, which covered a targeted murder with random killings. Yet, his theory discounts the fact that the killings could have gone unnoticed altogether. He also suspected the FBI wanted to keep the investigation open because the agency didn't want the public to see files showing how the case was botched. Confidentiality is required for unsolved cases. Meanwhile, Pierce Brooks, renowned FBI profiler, wanted the FBI to focus on Arnold, but there is no evidence the Bureau did. Instead, the FBI focused, got to flip. That's the superintendent at the time. The FBI focused on James Lewis, a con man in New York, who sent a letter the week after the killings were made public to McNeil Laboratories, Johnson & Johnson's subsidiary, demanding J&J pay $1 million or more killings would follow. The FBI's involvement in the case was all on shaky ground legally to begin with. They could be involved when the claim was mislabeling bottles, but Johnson & Johnson was clear of that. Chicago PD believed Arnold was the lead suspect, making the perp on the victim's Illinois residence. With Lewis as their prime suspect, though, the FBI could claim extortion through mail and crossing state lines to commit murder. Should Johnson & Johnson have shared responsibility for letting a killer access the warehouse? One poll showed 90% of the public held Johnson & Johnson blameless. They painted themselves as bystanding victims, if not relative heroes in the story, who stepped up at great expense to the company to try to save lives. But recently released records show Johnson & Johnson was not as cooperative with investigators as many believe. McNeil reps made repeated and urgent calls to drugstores served by Juul, but as far away from Chicago, like Logansport, Indiana. Yet drugstores only blocks from where the tainted bottles were bought, but serviced by other rack jobbers received no such warnings. So it sounds like they knew where the problem was. Johnson & Johnson and the authorities stated the poison was confined to the Chicagoland area, but a former J&J whistleblower claims executives knew almost immediately the killer worked for Juul, but kept this from investigators. The FDA might have uncovered all of this since they had expertise in drug distribution, but the FDA absolved J&J and surrendered its role, partially because of lack of funding due to a government shutdown. The FDA ran out of money on October 1st. FDA inspectors had to investigate using their own time and resources and gave the role of testing bottles for cyanide to Johnson & Johnson. The FDA claimed contamination was the result of tampering after the capsules had been shipped to distribution points and most likely after they reached retail shelves. The agency promoted the theory of store shelf contamination. The FDA commissioner in 1982 was Dr. Arthur Hayes Jr. He retired after it was revealed he took money from drug companies while holding the office. Investigations continue. Some evidence is being re-examined with modern equipment in hopes of finding trace DNA or fingerprints. But bottles and poison capsules were very contaminated by investigators. Sorting through all the genetic fingerprints poses a challenge. Yet Arnold's body was exhumed to retrieve genetic material, so perhaps time will give us a resolution to this case yet.